I could hear the rain tapping against the window as I sat at the edge of my bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to drown out the nagging feeling in my gut. Sarah had been my best friend for years, and for most of that time, I felt like we shared everything: laughs, secrets, even those awkward moments that only best friends can relate to. But lately, something had changed. It was like a shadow had stretched itself over our friendship, and I couldn't figure out why. The more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. The last few times I had hung out with her, she seemed distant, caught in her own world, and for me, it was painful to watch. Today, she had invited me over, and I felt like it was finally time to address the elephant in the room. I arrived at her place just as the rain began to pour harder, an uninvited reminder of the storm brewing in my chest. I knocked on the door, and after what felt like an eternity, she opened it, her hair damp and disheveled, her face showing signs of fatigue. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile that barely met her eyes. I stepped in, the warmth of her apartment wrapping around me like a blanket, but it didn't warm my heart. We made small talk for a few moments, but the words felt empty. I could feel the tension crackling between us, and I knew I had to break the spell. "Sarah, can we talk?" I said, my voice shaky. She looked at me, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Yeah, of course," she replied, leading me to the living room. We settled on opposite ends of the couch, the distance between us feeling almost insurmountable. I took a deep breath, deciding to take the plunge. "I've noticed you've been different lately. Is something going on that you want to share?" Her eyes flickered with a pain that made my heart sink, and for a moment, I thought she might just shut down. But then, she sighed and looked away towards the rain-soaked window. "I guess I've just been feeling overwhelmed," she said quietly. "Life has thrown a lot at me lately, and I didn't want you to worry." I shifted slightly, trying to catch her gaze, but she was lost in her own thoughts. "You're my best friend, Sarah. You don't have to go through this alone. I want to help you. Please don't shut me out." The moment hung in the air, thick and heavy, and I could see her fighting against whatever it was she was keeping inside. At last, she broke, tears spilling down her cheeks, the dam of her guarded emotions bursting open. "It's just everything feels like too much," she said, her voice trembling. "I lost my job last month, and I've been feeling so anxious about what comes next. I'm embarrassed to tell you. I didn't want to be a burden." My heart ached for her. "You could never be a burden to me. We all go through tough times. Let me be here for you, like you've always been there for me." Sarah looked at me, her eyes glistening with gratitude and shame, a mixture of vulnerability that reminded me of how much our friendship meant. "I didn't want to ruin what we had," she murmured, the walls she had built around her crumbling. "But in trying to protect you, I pushed you away." The truth of her words hit me hard, and I realized that in my pursuit to be strong for her, I had started to build walls of my own, walls that kept me from truly seeing her struggles. "It's okay to not be okay," I said gently. "We can lean on each other. You're allowed to feel this way." We spent the next several hours talking, sharing raw feelings and heartaches we had both buried under laughter and light banter. Sarah told me about her fears of job hunting, her long-standing battle with anxiety, and how she had felt like she was losing herself in the chaos of it all. I shared my own insecurities, my worries about failures, about feeling lost in my own life. The rain continued to pound against the window, but inside, the air was thick with catharsis and understanding. We were peeling back layers we had kept hidden, and with every confession that left our lips, I felt a bond rekindling, the fire of our friendship reigniting with a warm glow. By the time the sun began to set, casting a golden hue in the room, the conversation shifted from despair to hope. We made plans to support each other in our respective journeys, agreeing that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a strength that could only serve to deepen our connection. "Thank you for pushing me," Sarah said as we hugged tightly, tears still coursing down her cheeks but now mixed with smiles. "I always felt like I had to carry all this alone, and now I realize I don't." I pulled back, looking into her eyes, knowing I had made the right choice. "You're never alone," I promised. "And if we get through this together, we can face anything life throws at us." That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on how a difficult conversation had transformed our relationship. The storm outside had calmed, and along with it, the tempest of emotions inside us both had ebbed and flowed into a gentle river of understanding. Sarah and I had always been close, but now we were bonded by something deeper, something that came from honesty and the willingness to confront our own vulnerabilities. I fell asleep with a lighter heart and the images of our talks replaying in my mind, knowing that what had started as a struggle had turned into a reminder that true friendship endures through the darkest storm. The rain had washed away our barriers, leaving behind a stronger bond where love and authenticity flowed freely. I uncovered a family secret that changes everything. It all began on an ordinary Saturday afternoon while I was cleaning out my late grandmother's attic. My family had recently gathered to mourn her passing, and now it was time to sort through the remnants of her life. The attic was a treasure trove of dusty boxes, old furniture, and forgotten memories, each item telling a story that connected me to my family's history. As I rummaged through the clutter, I stumbled upon a battered old trunk tucked away in a corner, hidden beneath a tattered quilt. Its faded leather exterior was worn and cracked, and the rusty latch creaked as I pried it open, revealing a jumble of old photographs, letters, and various trinkets. Intrigued, I began sifting through the contents, holding each piece of my family's past in my hands. Most of the photographs were familiar, depicting family gatherings, birthdays, and holidays, but there was something off about a few of them. I found a picture of my grandmother, young and radiant, standing next to a man I had never seen before. They were smiling, and there was a spark in her eyes that I hadn't recognized before. I flipped it over, hoping for a name, but it was blank. My curiosity piqued. I dug deeper into the trunk, uncovering letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to my grandmother but written in an elegant, flowing script I didn't recognize. The letters were filled with sentiments of love and longing, but the name at the bottom was unfamiliar. Derek, it read. Confused, I pulled out more letters, reading snippets that hinted at a forbidden romance. It became clear that these letters were from a man whom my grandmother had loved deeply, but why had I never heard of him? I felt an unsettling sensation creep up my spine as I continued to search through the trunk, discovering a small locket tucked away in a silk pouch. When I opened it, I found a tiny photo of the same man alongside a note, "Forever in my heart, my love." My heart raced as I began to piece things together. Who was this man, and why had he been hidden from our family? My mind was swirling with questions, and I felt an urge to confront my mother about what I had uncovered. Later that evening, after gathering the courage to bring it up, I asked my mom about the trunk and the letters. She grew pale, her eyes widening in shock. "You shouldn't have gone through that," she said, her voice trembling. "There are things in there that are better left buried." Alarm bells rang in my head as I pressed her for details. "Mom, who is Derek? Why didn't you ever tell me about him?" Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to find her words. "Derek was a part of your grandmother's life that she wanted to forget. It was a mistake she made when she was young." I leaned in closer, desperate for the truth. What kind of mistake? Did she love him? My mother looked down, her hands shaking. Yes, she loved him. But he was married at the time, and when their affair came to light, it tore our family apart. Your grandmother was forced to cut ties with him, and she never spoke of it again. I felt a rush of emotions, swirling confusion, and anger bubbling within me. So, all these years, she kept this secret. Why didn't you ever tell me? My mom sighed, defeated. Because I wanted to protect you from the pain. It was a dark time for our family, and I didn't want to relive it. I stood there, processing the revelation. My grandmother, the sweet woman who had always baked cookies for us and shared stories of family adventures, had a hidden past that altered everything I thought I knew about her. I felt betrayed by the silence that had surrounded this part of our family history. "Does anyone else know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your aunts and uncles know bits and pieces, but they all agreed to keep it quiet," she confessed. "It's a secret that has haunted our family for decades." I could hardly believe it. This was more than just a family secret, it was a legacy of heartbreak and betrayal. I didn't know whether to feel sympathy for my grandmother or anger for her decisions. I felt compelled to uncover more about Derek, the man who had stolen her heart and then vanished from our lives. After our conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't finished yet. That night, I delved deeper into research. I spent hours online, searching for any trace of Derek. After a fruitless search, I stumbled upon an old newspaper archive that mentioned a tragic car accident decades ago. The article reported that a man named Derek Reynolds had died in a collision while traveling to a nearby city. The details sent chills down my spine. This man was not only a memory but a ghost that lingered in our family's history. I scoured the article for more details, discovering that he had been a well-liked local artist, someone my grandmother had adored. But why had she never told us? Why had she buried her past so deeply? Overwhelmed by the weight of the revelations, I decided I needed to visit my grandmother's grave. I felt a strong urge to connect with her, to understand the woman I had thought I knew. Standing at her grave, I felt a mix of emotions. I placed the locket and the letters on her tombstone, tears streaming down my face. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, searching for answers in the silence. "Why did you hide this part of yourself from me?" As I stood there, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, as if my grandmother were somehow present, urging me to forgive her. The weight of her secret was heavy, but I began to realize that it had shaped our family in ways I couldn't fully understand. I felt a need to honor her memory, not just as the grandmother I adored but as a woman who had lived, loved, and lost. After my visit, I couldn't help but think about how these revelations would affect my relationship with my family. I decided to gather my aunts and uncles for a family dinner, determined to share what I had learned. When they arrived, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. As we gathered around the table, I shared the story of Derek, the letters, and the hidden truth about our family history. Their faces turned pale, shock evident in their eyes. "We thought that was behind us," my Aunt Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Your grandmother's pain was ours too." The atmosphere shifted, filled with a mixture of anger and grief. "We had no idea how deeply it affected her," my Uncle Tom said, shaking his head. "She carried that burden alone." I felt a sense of responsibility for bringing the truth to light, knowing that it might lead to healing. As the evening went on, we shared our own memories of Grandma, recounting her stories and the way she had brought us all together. I realized that while the past was painful, it didn't have to define us. By uncovering the truth, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. We could finally acknowledge her pain and celebrate her life, flaws and all. The dinner ended with a promise to remember Grandma not just for the secrets she kept but for the love she gave us all. I found solace in knowing that while the truth was difficult, it had brought our family closer together. I left the dinner feeling lighter, ready to face whatever came next. I had uncovered a family secret that changed everything, and in doing so, I discovered the power of love, forgiveness, and the importance of embracing our history, no matter how complicated it may be. It started as a typical Friday night, the air thick with all the excitement that comes with the weekend ahead. I was at Jamie's house with a few friends, laughing, joking, and pretending that real life didn't exist outside his basement. We had a couple of bottles of cheap beer, a game of truth or dare that quickly spiraled into chaos, and the sort of camaraderie that only comes with youth. Somewhere in the haze of laughter and bravado, I dared Luke to steal something from the corner store down the road. It seemed harmless at the time, another silly intoxicated challenge among friends. To my surprise, Luke, always one to rise to a challenge, stumbled out of the basement, beer in hand and a wild gleam in his eye. We all sat in anticipation, waiting for him to either return with something ridiculous or, heaven forbid, get caught. The minutes felt eternal, our whispers growing more anxious. But then, in what felt like no time at all, Luke burst through the door, panting, his face a mix of triumph and sheer panic. He held up a candy bar and some ridiculous novelty item, like a rubber chicken or something even more absurd. We erupted into laughter, but that's when the night took a turn. Unbeknownst to us, as Luke had raced away from the store with his ill-gotten gains, a figure had been watching from the shadows, a figure that would soon alter our lives forever. An older man, at least in his late 50s, stepped into the light of Jamie's porch lamp, face twisted into anger and disbelief. His clothes were rumpled, and his eyes shone with a sharp glint of something I couldn't place. "You think this is funny?" he barked, startling the life out of us as we realized he wasn't just some random passerby, he was the store owner. My heart sank when he glanced at me, my mind racing back to the dare. I felt my cheeks heat with guilt because it had been my idea. The laughter died abruptly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the man's harsh breathing. "You need to teach your friend a lesson," he said, nostrils flaring as his glare leveled on me now. I wanted to protest, to argue that it was just a prank, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. "I'm going to give you a chance to fix this," he continued, and I could barely breathe. He demanded I accompany him back to the convenience store, where I would return the candy bar and offer an apology. The entire way there, anxiety gripped my insides like an iron claw. I replayed the evening in my head, realizing that if I'd never dared Luke, none of this would happen. I mentally kicked myself for being such an idiot, for not thinking of the potential consequences of my actions. As we walked through the neon lights toward the store, the man remained silent, and the weight of my guilt felt suffocating. Once there, he pushed me inside and told me to face the cashier. The woman behind the counter was in her late 20s, and she looked up, her expression marred by confusion as I stood there, the candy bar in hand. I'm sorry for what my friend did, I stammered out, practically choking on my words. It was just a stupid dare, and I didn't think it through. I didn't look at her but rather focused on the floor, hoping to vanish from existence. After several agonizing moments of silence, the woman sighed and placed her hands on the counter. You don't seem like a bad kid. This kind of thing happens all the time. I felt a flicker of relief, but the store owner, standing just behind me, coughed pointedly, and I knew I had to say more. I'll pay for it, I blurted out, feeling desperate to make this right. I reached into my pocket, dug out what little money I had, and handed it to her. I'll do community service if you want, I added hastily, somehow thinking that could also help alleviate my guilt. The owner's expression softened slightly, but still, he was far from forgiving. You don't just fix this with money or service. It's about understanding the impact of your actions. They can carry weight you don't yet understand. I think right then and there, as those words hung in the air, I realized he was right. My careless fun had the potential to cause real harm, perhaps even destroy lives in ways I couldn't see. It was a night filled with lessons I hoped I'd never forget. As we headed back to Jamie's, the atmosphere felt entirely different, electric with tension, shadows lingering where there once had been laughter. I had taken responsibility for my actions, and it had cost me far more than a candy bar. I didn't sleep much that night. The echo of the owner's words lingered in my mind, earning heavy weight as I replayed every moment that had led us to that basement, through the dares and laughter, and finally, this shocking encounter. I kept looking back, thinking about how a single dare had spiraled into something I never intended. The lesson stuck with me, shaping a turning point in my life. The next morning was cloudy, and I decided I would return to the store and speak to the owner again. As I walked to the convenience store, my stomach churned, half from the late-night beer I had consumed, half from the worry of facing him again. But I had to do it. I entered the store, and thankfully, it was quiet, no customers, just that familiar hum of the coolers. The owner was there, restocking shelves. He looked up and met my gaze. Back for more? He asked with an eyebrow raised, but there was also a hint of curiosity in his demeanor. I wanted to apologize again, I said, my voice steadier this time. I didn't take it seriously. I was being stupid, and I've come to understand that my actions can hurt others. He regarded me with a lingering scrutiny as if he was assessing the sincerity of my words. Do you truly understand what you've done? He inquired, and it felt like a test. I met his eyes. Yes. I'd like to help in any way I can. I want to make it right. A moment paused between us, heavy yet pregnant with purpose. Then, he sighed. All right. I'll let you help. You can come in after school and help me with stocking. And you need to think about why this matters going forward. I nodded, feeling lighter despite the weight of the responsibility ahead. As the weeks passed, I worked alongside him. The routine was simple, but the conversations we shared were profound. He shared stories of his own youth, careless decisions, and their consequences. I told him about friends who had made worse choices than mine, addiction, incarceration, lives ruined over a moment of poor judgment. In those moments, I learned about empathy, accountability, and the reality that everyone has a backstory, often filled with mistakes weighing heavy. The man taught me more than I could have imagined. He taught me about redemption. Each day felt like a step toward making amends, not just to him but rather to myself. I had taken responsibility for my actions, and in doing so, I had found a puzzle piece I didn't even know I was missing in my life. By the end of summer, that man had become a mentor to me, someone I admired for his strength and wisdom. I often think back to that fateful night. It was a lesson learned in the most unexpected way, a turning point that made me rethink my approach to every choice I would face in life. The connected threads of our stories entwine through a moment of carelessness, reminding me that every action has ripple effects. Now, every time I'm faced with a decision, big or small, I reflect, knowing full well the weight of responsibility is always within my grasp. It's the lesson that could have easily been lost had we just laughed it off. So, if you take anything away from this, let it be this: choices matter. Own up to them, because sometimes, a single dare can lead to an unforeseen journey, and it's up to you to make it a story worth sharing rather than one of regret. When I finally spoke my truth, I had no idea how dark it would become. It all started innocently enough. A few months ago, I moved back to my tiny hometown after a decade away. I was eager to reconnect with old friends and reclaim a sense of normalcy, maybe even peel back some layers of my forgotten past. I figured it would be a great opportunity to write and share, a purge of emotions I thought long buried. But as I settled back into my old life, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I dismissed it as paranoia, a product of a restless mind, but the feeling only intensified each day. Old ghosts seemed to linger, lurking just beyond the periphery of my awareness. My childhood home had always been peculiar. My parents bought it at an auction, and the previous owner was rumored to have disappeared mysteriously. The town whispered about dark rituals and secret gatherings that took place in the basement, a creaky, shadowy place I was drawn to but had never fully explored. One night, as the moon hung heavy and full, casting ghostly shadows across my old bedroom, I felt compelled to descend those stairs. Swallowing my anxiety, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down, my heart racing with each creak of the old wood beneath my feet. The air grew thick and cold. It was an unsettling mix of nostalgia and dread. I entered the basement, and the beam of my flashlight swept over long-forgotten furniture covered in dust. Suddenly, my light landed on a corner where the walls seemed to pulse with darkness, something alive hidden in the shadows. I could feel it staring back at me. Ignoring the voice in my head telling me to run, I approached, my pulse in my ears, and that's when I saw it, a crude symbol etched into the floor, surrounded by a circle of candles that had long since burned out. It pinched at my stomach, and for a brief moment, I felt dizzy. Flashbacks flooded my mind, washed up memories from my childhood, whispers of secrets I had buried deep. I began to remember an unsettling night in high school when a few friends and I had foolishly attempted to summon a spirit for fun. It hadn't gone as planned. The lights flickered as muffled laughter echoed around us. We didn't think much of it then, teenage bravado shielding us from reality. But something then felt wrong. I was jolted back to the present when I noticed a piece of paper half buried in the dust. With bated breath, I picked it up, revealing a list of names scrawled in a jagged, anxious handwriting. At the bottom of the list was mine. I froze. The list was dated years ago, a haunting memento from that foolish night. Panic clenched my throat, and I raced back up the stairs. Over the next few days, unease gripped me tighter. I tried to shake it off, to rationalize the creeping shadows that haunted my days. My experiences bled into my dreams, filled with half-formed faces, laughter, and that damned list haunting me. The irony was suffocating. I wanted to talk, to confess to the lingering dread I felt about that night, but how could I admit that I'd unloosed something dark with my careless words? When I finally confided in a friend, an old acquaintance from school, I felt an instant weight lift. I poured out all my stories, the laughter of our youth, the secrets of the basement, how our childish games might have woken something we didn't understand. Their eyes widened, and it struck me how crazy it sounded. But they didn't laugh. Instead, they leaned in closer, whispering about an old urban legend, one that claimed those who had spoken their truths in that basement had never truly awakened the spirits, merely drawn the attention of something more sinister. A connection clicked in my mind. A week later, I gathered my courage again, returning to the house one last time. I needed to confront whatever I had unleashed. Flashes of the past played out in my mind as I descended again, the darkness wrapping around me like an old friend. With the list clutched tightly in my hand, I stood in the center of the basement, surrounded by the shadows. I was young, I began, my voice trembling, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you. The air thickened with an oppressive silence. I spoke louder, forcing the words out, letting my truth bleed into the darkness. I've learned, and I regret what we did that night. I'm here to set things right. The temperature dropped even further. A flicker of light danced from the corner of my eye, shadows shifting in ways they shouldn't. I felt the heaviness envelop me, the realization that acknowledging my role in that past was only the beginning. Without warning, the basement filled with whispers, echoing my confession until I could hardly think straight. I stumbled back, my breath coming in gasps. It wasn't just echoes of the past, I could feel them, disembodied voices calling out, furious and desperate. I turned to run but tripped and fell to the ground, panic blinding me. Shadows curled around, swirling in a menacing dance as a chill ran down my spine. "You spoke," they hissed, a chorus of voices merged into one. "And now you must face the consequence." I scrambled to my feet, the whispers clawing at my consciousness, images of my friends, older versions of ourselves, broken by our silence and foolishness. I had opened a door that I couldn't shut, dragging me deeper into a nightmare that played out like a twisted theater of my own regrets. My friends had tried to reach out, they'd been silenced by their own fears. The understanding hit me then, breaking beneath the weight of their collective silence. Those truths had festered long enough, now spilling over, seeking retribution against the one who had finally spoken. I bolted back up the stairs, the shadows lurching behind me, relentless in their pursuit. I burst through the front door, gasping for air, but the voices didn't stop. They clung to my psyche like a poisonous fog. "You opened the door," they taunted, fading into the night. I stumbled into my car, heart racing, desperate to escape the town that had held me prisoner. But even as the engine roared to life, I felt them all around me, an eternal echo of truths spoken and buried. And as I drove away, I realized my confession had not freed me, it had only made me their vessel. I can't go back, even if I tried. The truth I finally spoke has become a chain, binding me to those shadows forever. They whisper at the edge of my mind, reminding me that once you've spoken, there's no shadow that will ever let you go. So if you're ever in your hometown, wherever that may be, beware of the ghosts that lie in wait. The darkness craves to be acknowledged. It feeds on your confessions, and once you give voice to your truth, you might find that it has more to say than you ever intended. I never believed in the power of positivity until the day it nearly cost me my sanity. It started as an ordinary Thursday in the suburban wasteland I called home, a place where hope seemed as rare as a sunny day in winter. I woke up grumpy, the kind of grumpy that makes you hate your existence. The gray sky hung low, matching my mood perfectly. My job at the office was dull. My girlfriend, Mia, had recently broken up with me, and my car refused to start. I grumbled my way through a bland breakfast of cold cereal, the milk staring back at me like a disdainful ghost. I realized I couldn't keep living like this. An image popped into my mind, an advertisement for a local positivity workshop I'd skimmed through earlier in the week. I told myself, today's the day things change, and for the first time in ages, I took a little leap of faith. I signed up for the workshop without a second thought, though my internal cynic rolled its eyes. The dubious ad read, "Unlock the happiness within." As if there were a treasure chest buried deep inside me just waiting to be unearthed. Ironically, that very thought felt like a fleeting joke. The workshop was held in an old community center, with peeling paint and flickering lights that seemed to groan as people shuffled in. In the dimly lit room filled with folding chairs, I recognized several familiar faces from the neighborhood, people I usually avoided. There was Dan from the corner store, and Lydia, who never smiled at the coffee shop. But here, we all carried a bizarre sense of camaraderie. A wave of awkward introductions crashed against my icy apathy. The instructor, a middle-aged woman with a bright yellow dress and an infectious grin named Carla, stepped onto the stage, radiating an energy that felt strangely out of place in that depressing room. "Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to learn how to change the way we think." Her voice sliced through the air like a sunbeam breaking through clouds. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of annoyance. What did she know about my life? But then, as she spoke of life being like a garden, filled with choices of whether to plant seeds of positivity or to let them wither in negativity, I felt the shackles of my despair start to loosen. Something started to bubble deep inside me, a distant memory of childhood bliss I thought I'd lost forever. Though I fought it, I found myself joining in on cheesy affirmations and silly exercises meant to evoke joy. I closed my eyes as the room filled with chants of "I am enough and I attract positivity." The more we screamed, the harder it became to suppress my laughter and sorrow. Before I knew it, I was smiling, not just a forced grin, but a genuine smile that felt foreign and exhilarating at the same time. Soon, we reached an exercise where everyone paired off to share something they were grateful for. I ended up with Dan from the corner store, and as he spoke about his family and how they got through tough times together, I felt a warmth enveloping my heart. For the first time in years, I realized that life had moments worth celebrating. At the end of the workshop, Carla instructed us to take our newfound positivity into the world, like spreading sunshine through a dark storm. I left feeling lighter, the gray clouds above seemed a little brighter. Over the next few days, I embraced my newfound outlook. I smiled at strangers, engaged in conversations, and stepped outside my comfort zone. It was contagious. I felt like I was walking on clouds, and before I knew it, the small joys of life started filling the void I'd known for so long. But then, a strange twist of fate appeared. My once mundane life began to shift in inexplicable ways. I stumbled upon a stray puppy on my morning jog and ended up adopting him, naming him Sunny, of course. Every encounter felt synchronized, as though my life was a tapestry woven with threads of chance, joy, laughter, and a sprinkle of magic. These good vibes didn't just boost my morale, they attracted people. Suddenly, it seemed like everyone wanted to be my friend. My phone buzzed with messages, people wanted to hang out, go for drinks, do everything I had previously rejected. I had unofficially become the neighborhood positivity guru. However, lurking beneath the surface, I noticed that my positive outlook came with a strange cost. Shadows trembled at the edges of my happiness as if waiting to pounce. I laughed it off for days, an irrational fear manifesting from deep-seated cynicism. Even Sunny had an odd habit of growling at the corners of our living room. I shrugged it off until one evening, as I sat on my couch reflecting on my extraordinary transformation, a chilling draft swept through the room. It was then I caught a glimpse of something in the corner, just outside the light. Something dark, a shadowy figure that flickered and faded like a fluke. I stood up shocked, as it felt like everything positive around me was trying to drown that shadow in a flood of light. Each time I felt happiness or gratitude, the darkness intensified, whispering chilling thoughts in a voice only I could hear. You don't deserve this. You know it'll all fall apart. I tried to ignore it, push it away, cling to the euphoria I had just grasped, but the shadow grew bolder, thrumming on the walls of my mind. I began to dread my overly cheerful persona, like I was wearing a mask that didn't fit. One night, I sat on the couch, Sunny curled up next to me, as the whispers grew louder, they smell your fear. They know you're pretending. After a few sleepless nights, I decided to reach out for help, fearing I was losing my grip on reality. I returned to the same community center for a follow-up workshop. As I sat among familiar faces, haunted by the shadow at the edge of my vision, Carla appeared, but she looked different this time. There was a whisper of something otherworldly about her smile. Her approach felt genuine yet sinister as she preached about the battle between light and darkness residing within everyone. When I shared my fears, my experiences, she merely smiled wider, telling me, "You'll learn it's all in your control." In that moment, I understood Carla wasn't an unassuming positivity coach, she was something deeper, someone who danced on the line between light and dark. By the end of the night, I realized my shadow was like a dark echo of every moment of despair I had buried. And the more I pushed it away, the stronger it became. I began to understand that forcing positivity couldn't erase the shadows, rather, it created an imbalance within me. I took a deep breath, confronting the whispers, allowing myself to feel the darkness without judgment. "You belong here too," I murmured quietly into the void. As I admitted its existence, I suddenly felt lighter, freeing myself from the weight of denial. The shadow receded, ebbing away into an understanding that life is about harmony, not just light. That day, I learned something profoundly important. The power of positivity was not in ignoring the dark but in embracing both light and shadow as part of my being. With that knowledge, I transformed my experience into an authentic portrayal of life instead of an unrealistic fairy tale, a genuine acceptance of the flaws and imperfections. As I stepped back into the world, I looked up at the gray sky that now seemed to have hints of blue peeking through. My heart swirled with gratitude, not just for the good but for the lessons that came from my shadows. The power of positivity was a journey, not a destination. Even as I walked away from that community center, I understood that in life, the dance between darkness and light is what makes our existence beautiful, a balance worth celebrating. I never thought rejection could lead me to find my true strength, but I guess life has a way of surprising you. It all started on an overcast Tuesday in March. I had just graduated from college with a degree in psychology, and my dream was to become a therapist. The job market was brutal, but I kept my hopes up and sent my resume to every clinic in the area. After weeks of anxious waiting, I finally got a call for an interview at a small, well-respected clinic. My heart raced as I prepared, visualizing every detail of that conversation. I practiced my answers, dressed in my best outfit, and arrived 30 minutes early on the day of the interview. However, as I sat in that sterile waiting room with beige walls and uncomfortable plastic chairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. When I was finally called in, I took a deep breath, smiled, and introduced myself. The panel, a stern-looking woman with glasses, a younger man with messy hair, and an older man in a crisp suit, welcomed me in. I answered their questions with enthusiasm, drawing on personal experiences and my studies. But as the interview progressed, I noticed subtle shifts in their demeanor. The younger man leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, while the older man scribbled notes with an unimpressed look. My heart sank, but I pushed through, eager to convey my passion for helping others. At the end, they thanked me for my time, and I left, feeling a knot forming in my stomach as I stepped back into the damp air outside. Days passed until I received that fateful call. I was sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling through endless job boards when my phone buzzed. With a mix of hope and dread, I answered. "Thank you for your interest in the position, but we've decided to go in a different direction," the woman on the other end said. My heart shattered, scattering pieces of hope across the floor. I thanked her politely, but as soon as I hung up, I collapsed. I was drowning in rejection, my dreams slipping through my fingers. I spent the next few days in a haze, wallowing in my disappointment. I wanted to cry, shout, something, but all I could do was binge-watch cooking shows and pretend everything was fine. My friends tried to rally me, offering support and encouragement, but I brushed them off. I became a hermit, shutting myself in, trapped in my own thoughts and spiraling deeper into despair. It wasn't until one evening, while staring blankly at my laptop, that I received an unexpected message from Charlie, a guy I hadn't spoken to in years. We had been friends in high school, but life had pulled us in different directions. He said he was coming back to our hometown, and I should join him for coffee. I was hesitant at first, overcome by embarrassment and insecurity, but something within me urged me to take that step. I responded affirmatively with the faint hope that maybe reconnecting could lift my spirits. We met at a quaint cafe, the scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air. There he was, the same goofy grin from years past, completely unaware of my struggles. We talked for hours, reminiscing about old times. He mentioned how he had faced his own rejections after struggling to land jobs right after college. As he shared his story, something clicked inside me. I realized how resilience was a theme we all grappled with at various points in our lives. To my surprise, I found myself confiding in him about my recent rejection and the darkness that followed. Charlie listened intently, nodding with empathy, and shared his own moments of fear and failure. It was refreshing, this raw honesty. He didn't tell me to brush it off or suggest empty platitudes. Instead, he talked about how he overcame his challenges by focusing on his passions. "It's okay to feel lost," he said thoughtfully, "but don't let it define you. You're stronger than you think." Those words stuck with me. They ignited a spark that I had been desperately trying to extinguish, the idea that rejection wasn't the end, but perhaps a redirection towards something better. In the weeks that followed, buoyed by my conversation with Charlie, I decided to pivot. I went back to my roots of helping others, but in a different way. I signed up for volunteer work at a local shelter where I could offer emotional support to those in need. Each session, I learned not only about their struggles but also about the strengths they possessed. They fought battles I could hardly fathom, yet so many of them carried remarkable resilience, something I desperately needed to emulate. Gradually, I began to feel a shift within myself. Each story I heard became a thread that stitched up the gaping holes left by my rejection. I encountered people who inspired me with their tenacity. A single mother working 2 jobs, a veteran struggling with PTSD, a teenager determined to break free from the cycle of poverty, all confident that they had the power to shape their destiny despite their circumstances. Through the lens of their experiences, I discovered a newfound perspective. I threw myself into my work, embracing every moment, using it as a tool for healing. I practiced active listening, and empathy became a skill I polished with each session. Months passed, the weight of rejection slowly lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose. I had developed my strength not as a therapist but as a human being. I learned to face life's disappointments with a braver heart. And then, as I thrived in volunteering, an unexpected opportunity arose. The same clinic that had previously rejected me reached out. They had an opening for a support role, and before I knew it, the universe blessed me with a chance to work alongside the very people who had once turned me away. This time, I walked in with confidence, equipped with experiences that deepened my understanding of the human spirit. The interview felt different. I wasn't just a candidate seeking a job, I was a person who had faced failures and emerged resilient. By the time I left, I knew whether I got the position or not, I had already won. I carried that sentiment with me into the next chapter of my life. Rejection had carved out space for growth, filled with lessons of humility and strength. Now, as I sit here writing this, I can confidently say facing rejection was the catalyst I needed. It made me dig deeper and reassess who I wanted to be in this world. So if you're reading this and feeling defeated by rejection, know that behind every setback lies the potential for unimaginable growth. You may not see it now, but sometimes the door to your true calling only opens after addressing the lies rejection tells you. Embrace the pain. Let it guide you toward your strength, and you just might find something extraordinary along the way. When I found a mentor who changed my life, I had no idea that meeting him would drag me into a nightmare I could never have imagined. I was 22, freshly graduated and desperate for direction. Feeling lost and overwhelmed, I stumbled across an online forum dedicated to self-improvement and success, and there, among the posts by overly optimistic youth, I found a reply that stood out. It was from a man who called himself Mr. Blackwood. His words were a mixture of dark wisdom and an oddly comforting tone that told me he understood the struggles of the lost. After a few back-and-forth interactions, he suggested we meet in person, claiming he had some valuable insights that could change my life. I should have felt an ounce of caution, but my desperation overpowered my instincts. I agreed to meet him at a small cafe on the edge of town. When I finally saw him, Mr. Blackwood was an imposing figure, tall, dressed entirely in black, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through me. He wasted no time in introducing himself. "You seek knowledge, don't you?" he said, and I nodded, feeling oddly entranced by his charisma. For hours, he spoke about life's hidden opportunities, the keys to success, and the fate that awaits those who embrace their true potential. The gravity of his words pulled me in further, and by the end of our meeting, I believed that he was my ticket to a better future. He offered me his mentorship, insisting that I had raw potential I just needed guidance to unlock. Delighted and eager, I accepted his offer without a second thought. Over the next few weeks, our meetings became more intense. Each session spiraled deeper into discussions that felt almost hypnotic. He pushed me to confront my fears, and while I never felt entirely comfortable, there was something intoxicating about his methods. One afternoon, he told me about the dark door, an exercise he claimed would help me shed my past and emerge reborn. I was skeptical, but part of me was yearning for change. He guided me to a rundown building that looked like it hadn't seen a soul in years. It was ominously quiet, with dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that broke through broken windows. He instructed me to repeat a mantra he had given me while standing in front of a heavy wooden door that seemed to vibrate with an energy all its own. I felt compelled to obey, my pulse quickening as I whispered the words, "I am ready. I will embrace the darkness to find my light." As I spoke, the air grew colder, the shadows around me more pronounced. Just as I finished speaking, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a dark corridor that seemed to stretch into oblivion. I hesitated, an instinctual warning flashing through my brain. "You need to step through," Mr. Blackwood encouraged, his voice hypnotic. "This is your moment." Trying to shake the fear creeping into my chest, I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into pitch blackness. I walked forward, unsure of where I was going. With each step, I felt the weight of something vast and shifting around me. It was suffocating, pressing against my skin like a heavy fog. An eerie sensation swept through me, and I suddenly felt as if I weren't alone. Whispers began to fill the air, indistinct but insistent, tugging at the edges of my consciousness as if I was being beckoned deeper into the abyss. Panic surged through me. I turned to run back to the door, but it had vanished. Paralyzed by fear, I stumbled through the darkness, grasping at the thin air, but instead of finding escape, I found myself enveloped in a growing sense of despair. The whispers became more urgent, transforming into piercing shrieks that echoed in my mind. I felt the energy around me shift to something overwhelmingly malevolent. The oppressive darkness swallowed me whole, and just when I thought I would lose myself entirely, I saw a flicker of light ahead. Driven by desperation, I dashed towards it. As I neared what turned out to be another door, I reached for the handle, praying the chaos would quell. Bursting through, I emerged back into the cafe, but something was off. The sunlight outside felt harsh, and the people in the cafe appeared frozen in time, staring vacantly. Confused, I turned to find Mr. Blackwood waiting, a twisted smile on his lips. "Welcome back, my pupil," he said, but his eyes no longer held the warmth I remembered. Instead, they burned with a cold, calculating gleam that sent icy tendrils of fear crawling down my spine. "You've finally experienced the darkness." I wanted to scream, to run away, but my body wouldn't listen. His presence felt inescapable, wrapping around me like a shroud. "What did you do to me?" I croaked, my voice trembling as the weight of the experience hit me. "You have embraced your truth," he replied cryptically, stepping closer, his shadow enveloping me. "But don't you see? You now have power, untapped potential, and you're one of us. Welcome to the fold." I wanted to deny it, but something deep within me resonated with his words, and so I did the only thing I could, I nodded. From that day onward, my life changed irreversibly. I found success, opportunity, and a strange sense of fulfillment, but at a terrible price. I adopted Mr. Blackwood's methods, leaning into the darkness he encouraged. Each night, I found myself wandering back to that cursed door, each session pushing me further as I craved the eerie elation it brought. The line between mentor and demon blurred as I delved deeper into a world where ambition drowned out morality. It wasn't long before I began experiencing visions, horrific fragments of others' lives, their dark secrets surfacing to me as I navigated the haunted corridors of my mind. Instead of feeling compassionate, I reveled in the power of knowing things I shouldn't. I distanced myself from friends and family, no longer needing their approval or care, consumed instead by this insatiable hunger for knowledge that Mr. Blackwood had awakened within me, yet with every step forward, I felt a piece of my humanity slip away like smoke. The whispers returned, constantly tugging at my consciousness, feeding me slivers of temptation that twisted my awakening into something grotesque. But as his influence grew, so too did my fear. One night, I returned home to find Mr. Blackwood waiting for me. His figure loomed in shadows, and panic clawed at my throat. "You've done well, my student," he said, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. What was once encouragement now sounded like a demand. "But you know what you must do next, don't you?" I glanced around my apartment, filled with dark trophies of my academic and professional success, remnants I believed proved I was thriving. But they felt hollow now, mere masks for the monster I was becoming. I grew frantic, realizing I was trapped with no escape, my mind battling between the mentor I once saw as a guide and this soulless manipulator reaping the benefits of my ambition. I had to break free. "No, I won't," I whispered, but the grip of the darkness tightened around me, draining my resolve as visions of past lives danced before my eyes, lives I ruined in my relentless pursuit of success. "You will," he hissed, stepping closer until his breath was cold against my skin. I felt it then, an understanding of what had been lost. In a blur of adrenaline, I fled from the haunted shadows of my own making, running until my lungs burned. I could feel his eyes on me, chasing me even from the depths of my self-made abyss. I ventured too far and lost sight of who I originally was, teetering on the brink of a darkness threatening to consume me whole. I kept running until I found myself in front of that cursed building, the place where it all began. The door loomed before me, both inviting and terrifying. I hesitated, feeling the weight of Mr. Blackwood's influence bearing down on me. To reclaim myself, I knew I had to face him. I pushed open the door, bracing myself for whatever lay ahead. The corridor felt colder, more oppressive, like a grave waiting to swallow me whole. I stepped into the darkness once more, reciting that mantra even as fear gripped me, prepared to plunge into the depths of my own psyche. I would confront not just Mr. Blackwood, but the darkness within myself. In that moment of clarity, I realized my mentor wasn't a person, but a manifestation of my own demons, my greed, my lust for knowledge, the yearning to escape reality. I knew I had to strip away the darkness, confront my flaws, and reclaim the light that flickered deep inside me. What I found in the depths of that corridor was both terrifying and liberating, the faces of those I had wronged twisted through my mind, and I felt their pain as if it were my own. I screamed, allowing the anguish to pour forth, shattering the shadows surrounding me. The corridor trembled, and suddenly, Mr. Blackwood's form materialized, a dark figure filled with rage and desperation. "You cannot escape," he yelled as I charged toward him. But I was no longer the lost pupil, I was reclaiming my power. I made the choice to fight, releasing all I had absorbed from his dark teachings until it surged through my fingers, coalescing into a brilliant light. I thrust it toward him, and for a brief moment, I saw real fear in his eyes before he disintegrated into a cascade of shadows. Silence settled, wrapping around me like a shield. I had stepped through the darkness, embraced it, and emerged reborn. I woke in the cafe, but this time, life resumed all around me, the people moving as they should. I felt like I had returned from a long, harrowing journey. My resolve was stronger, and the weight of the darkness had lifted. I would not forget Mr. Blackwood or the lessons he taught me, but I now understood their origin. It was up to me to forge my path, filled with hope and light. Today, I share my story as a cautionary tale. Seeking a mentor can illuminate your path, but be wary of the darkness that sometimes lurks behind the facade of wisdom. Know yourself, embrace your light, and heed the whispers that forever float around you, for they may be your guiding stars or the demons from which you must flee. It was a day like any other when I decided that this was the day I would face my fears. I had spent years being imprisoned by panic attacks, crippling anxiety, and a deep-rooted phobia of the dark. I know that sounds cliché, but the shadows had a life of their own in my mind. They thrived on my doubts and flourished in my fears. I had crafted an elaborate routine to avoid anything that could trigger me. I rarely went out after sunset and always made sure to have my lights on. But on this day, I woke up with a determined fire burning within me, stubbornly refusing to allow the darkness to rule my life any longer. I started simple. I went for a walk in a small park I used to love. The sunlight streamed through the branches, and the chirping of birds filled the air. It was a picturesque scene, and I felt a moment of serenity wash over me, but that only lasted until dusk approached. My heart began to race as shadows crept closer, festering their way into my mind. I fought against it, pushing myself to remain where I was, feeling a strange sense of rebellion against the fear that threatened to swallow me whole. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "You can do this," I whispered to myself. When I opened my eyes, I saw two kids playing hide and seek. Their laughter echoed like a siren call, urging me to join them, to leave the demons behind, if only for a moment. But as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, those kids vanished back into the safety of their homes, and suddenly, I was alone, surrounded by encroaching darkness. I could feel the panic rising again, but I had committed to this path of confrontation. I pulled out my phone, trying to distract myself by scrolling through social media while the last of the light flickered away. But my phone went dead, the screen blackening as if the darkness had swallowed it. My stomach dropped. Here I was, without light, and with absolutely no sense of direction. At that moment, every ounce of determination I had built up began to crumble away. I tried to find the path back but realized I had wandered further than I had planned. I was about to turn back when I heard a rustling nearby, something snapping off a branch with enough force to send adrenaline prickling down my spine. I froze. Thump. It was closer now. My heart raced, and I could feel the sweat forming on my brow as I turned back towards the sound. There was nothing but darkness, thick, palpable, choking darkness. I cursed myself for being so foolish. I heard the rustling again, louder this time, and my gut instinct was to run, but my feet remained glued to the ground, paralyzed by fear. Then, just when I thought my heart might leap right out of my chest, I saw it, a shape emerging from the bushes. I couldn't breathe, could barely think. My mind raced through every horror story I had ever read, every fantasy flick I had ever seen. But it wasn't some malevolent creature that emerged, rather, it was a small, scruffy dog with wide eyes and a wagging tail. My initial fear began to ebb as I knelt down, realizing this little furball wasn't any danger at all. It came closer, sniffing cautiously before leaning into my touch. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound raspy and hysterical as I ruffled its fur. But as much as I appreciated having a companion, I couldn't stay out there forever. I had to get home before the darkness became too encompassing. I stood up, held the dog's leash, which was conveniently tied around its collar, and decided to walk through the park, keeping the lights of my neighborhood in mind. As we navigated through the twists and turns of the shadows, I found myself unexpectedly calmed by the little creature at my side. The tension in my chest slowly started to loosen, reminding me of another evening spent underneath the stars, an innocent moment when I felt free, unburdened by fears that seemed insurmountable. But suddenly, the tranquility shattered. The moment I turned a corner, the shadows roared back to life, coiling around me like serpents. Panic seized me. My breathing escalated, and I felt that familiar, icy grip tightening around my chest. The dog let out a growl, but oddly, it wasn't directed towards me. I followed its gaze, snapping my head to look where it was fixated. In front of me was a figure cloaked in the darkness, a tall silhouette that stood eerily still. My heart felt as though it was clutching a fistful of ice, and dread seeped into my veins. I could barely comprehend the shape. It was the kind of sight you only see in twisted nightmares, all sharp angles and vague features. But something stopped me in my tracks, some strange intuition urging me to not look away. At that moment, I felt an alien sensation wash over me. It wasn't terror, but curiosity. To my surprise, I stepped forward, invoking the very fear that momentarily paralyzed me. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing as the dark figure remained silent. To my astonishment, the shadow spoke in a voice drenched in shadows. "I want you to face what you fear most." The words rippled through the air, embracing the tension with a chilling calm. "You want to be free, you want to escape the prison you've built inside your mind. But the first thing you must understand is that fear itself is just a part of you," it continued. Those words stuck to me like a fresh wound. I took a shaky breath and flung my hands open wide. "I won't be afraid anymore," I declared. Silence enveloped us for a heartbeat, before the figure melted into the shadows and whispered softly, "Then you are free." It was as if I'd passed through a storm, the panic evaporated like shadows in sunrise. The little dog barked happily, excited as if it understood my transformation. For the first time, I turned and ran toward the light at the end of the path, every stride echoing through the silence like a triumphant hymn. I felt unshackled, liberated from the tight hold of fear as I sprinted past the trees, all while the shadows faded behind me. I reached home, breathless and exhilarated, slamming the door shut, enveloped in warmth and safety. And there, that little dog, my unexpected companion, looked at me as if to say I was never meant to be alone. I sat on my couch, heart racing, only to realize that I had truly faced my fears and emerged from the other side. The darkness would come again, it always did. But now, I understood, the shadows could never truly consume me, they were just a part of the landscape of my life. From that day on, I never let fear dictate my life again.
It's tough being the daughter of a superhero. I never asked for it, but there I was, standing on the edge of the bustling city, feeling the weight of my father's legacy bearing down on me like a shadow, especially when every day at school was a reminder of what I could never be. My dad, known as Sentinel, was the city's golden boy, the man who could conjure storms and bend steel as if it were twine, celebrated with accolades while I languished in the deep corners of his fame, set apart by an invisible barrier. My classmates would relentlessly pepper me with questions. What's it like being his daughter? As if my life was an extension of his superhuman powers, but they didn't understand, the glitzy exterior belied a storm beneath. After school, when the bells rang and laughter ebbed into the background, I would often sit in the kitchen, staring at the photographs of my father in costume, cape fluttering majestically, while I slouched in a corner, unknown and unremarkable. I used to believe the loneliness of it all was just a phase, but then the whispers started. At first, they were subtle, an echo of a voice barely audible behind closed doors, drawing me into a dark tapestry of secrets that unraveled when I found an ancient journal buried in the attic. The pages spoke of my father's greatest battles, each entry more gripping than the last, chronicling victories over foes that seemed tangible, only for the ink to curl into madness with mentions of the reckoning, a shadowy figure who sought not only to confront Sentinel but to dismantle everything he loved, most terrifyingly, me, and I learned that heroes could bleed and fall just like everyone else. I convinced myself I could be brave, I needed to be. What if I could uncover the truth, prove that I wasn't just Sentinel's sideline but a worthy heir? The moment I resolved to sneak out that night should have felt liberating, but as darkness draped over the city like a shroud, it felt more like a sentence, and with nothing but the pale moon for company, I crept toward his hideout in the old electric factory that had served as his battleground, its walls thick with the fallen whispers of his glory. I summoned all my courage, gripping the rusted handle of the door, praying the creak wouldn't betray my presence, while shadows flickered under the dim security lights. Inside, I didn't find glory, I found a realm twisted by dread, a strange amalgamation of metal and shattered glass, where echoes of my father's battles thudded in the air, and the atmosphere felt electric yet foreboding. That's when I spotted her, a woman draped in dark, tattered remnants of a costume that resembled my father's but twisted and warped like something out of a nightmare, her eyes glimmering with malice as she turned to face me, and in that moment, I realized with chilling clarity that she was the reckoning, the woman who had loomed over my father's legacy like a vengeful ghost, and everything I thought I knew unraveled like a sinister string. "You think you're safe because he wears the suit?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that turned my skin to ice. "He's built this world for you, but I will tear it apart, starting with you." Bravery morphed into terror, and I felt the dark grip of despair clawing at me as she lunged, and in that heartbeat, I knew I wasn't just fighting for my life, I was fighting to shatter the smooth veneer of my father's world. With a desperate push, I darted past her, adrenaline surging as I stumbled through the factory, feeling the heat of chaos behind me, but the space twisted into a maze, and I was lost, breathless and frenzied, navigating through echoes of a battle long past. In each dark corner, I imagined my father battling the very specter that now hunted me, and as the lights flickered ominously, I found myself at a dead end, a towering wall with splatters of faded blood that told tales I wasn't ready to understand. Just as I turned to face the spectral villain, I caught a glimpse of something glittering, a shard of steel, broken in the chaos, reflecting the dim light like a beacon of hope. In a whirlwind of thought, I grasped it, fueled by sheer desperation and the instinctual will to protect. The reckoning rounded the corner, her laughter echoing like thunder, and with a primal scream, I launched myself toward her, steel slashing through the dark air. My strike caught her off guard, forcing a low hiss from her lips, and in that fleeting moment, I recognized the fear in her eyes, the fear that I, the daughter of Sentinel, was no longer a mere shadow but a force of my own. She recoiled, but there was no time to revel in victory. I darted away again, adrenaline propelling me through the labyrinth of despair until I wrenched open an exit door, stumbling into the adrenaline-infused chaos of the city outside, where heroes clashed against shadows the Clark family had never seen. The lights assaulted my senses, and amid the cacophony of sound, my father's familiar voice boomed through the air, confronting the reckoning with a fury that sent chills down my spine. Terrified but emboldened by my own defiance, I watched as my father, glowing with strength and power, obliterated shadows, just as I had. It was then I understood, the world wasn't simply about grandiose battles. It was about protecting those you loved, no matter how daunting the legacy. As the duel waged on and I stood on the sidelines, my heart racing, I found my voice amidst the tumult, shouting warnings, strategies. I might not possess the strength of my father, but my fearlessness defined me as much as my lineage. Victory came not only for Sentinel but for me, and in the aftermath, as I embraced my father under the city's soaring lights, I felt an unyielding bond knit together in that overwhelming chaos. I realized that it wasn't enough to just be his daughter. I had my own power, not from capes or masks, but from my choice to stand tall in the face of shadows threatening to engulf us both. And while the world may never fully understand the complexity and the cost of being the daughter of a superhero, I had finally begun to carve my own name into the darkness, a beacon fighting alongside heroes, defiantly ready to face whatever nightmares awaited in the shadows. They never listen. They never believe. But I'll keep trying, because that's all I can do. That's all I've ever been able to do. My heart raced as I watched the townsfolk gaze over my shoulder, laughing at the darkness creeping in, unaware that they were on borrowed time. It started when I was 8, the whispers in the walls became impossible to ignore one fateful night when I followed them down into the damp, unlit basement of my grandparents' house, a relic of long-forgotten memories and old secrets. They reached for me with their slithering voices, urgent and pleading, but those echoes morphed into terrifying screams as I stumbled across a crudely buried chest. I opened it, igniting the air with a sickly sweet stench of rot. Inside lay old photographs of children who once played in our town, their eyes darkened and lifeless in a way that gripped my spine as I realized they weren't simply memories, they were warnings, relics of the town's buried past. I tried to tell my parents, tried to tell others, but they dismissed me, chided me for my overactive imagination, and, worse yet, my peers mocked me for my fears, which only deepened my resolve. Week after week, as I spiraled deeper into obsession, the sounds grew louder, relentless. They called to me, promising power if I'd only set them free. I remember the night they first took one of us, a girl from my class, her laughter now a distant memory. Everyone else shrugged it off as just another disappearance, but I knew better. I pressed harder, seeking the truth, only to be met with scorn each time. So I began to investigate alone, combing through every library's dusty shelf, piecing together lore of our town's twisted history, and soon I came to a chilling realization: whatever sinister force dwelled beneath us had claimed the souls of children every generation, feeding off them to preserve its own existence. The restless whispers grew into a violent cacophony, begging for a connection, and that's when I made the most horrific mistake. I drew a simple sigil in my notebook, a forgotten child's drawing, twisted and wrong, and when I unwittingly chanted the words, the air turned electric, and I felt something tear through the fabric of reality. It was like opening a door to a nightmare that had been waiting for me, and the thing on the other side was hungry. I felt its icy breath on my neck, pulling me towards a hypnotic shadow that flickered at the edges of my vision. The next morning, the world felt darker. The sun barely broke through the clouds, and the townsfolk went about their routines, oblivious to the creeping dread that has etched itself into the very bones of the town. Every night after that, I heard tapping, gentle at first, like a child trying to get my attention, but soon escalating into frantic pounding, demanding I listen. They told me to run, to hide, to warn everyone, yet every word was met with more disbelief. "You shouldn't let your imagination run wild," the adults said as they glanced away in pity. I could see the glimmers of their fear lurking behind their laughter, but they didn't understand that laughter leaves you vulnerable. As days turned into weeks, those voices grew stronger, more distinct. I could almost see their faces, twisted, terrified, and begging for redemption. The townsfolk started disappearing one by one. The police opened a missing persons case, but they didn't listen to the whispers that echoed in the wind, and every time I tried to explain, they just shook their heads, blind to the truth so vividly clear to me. I felt it then, a deep, gnawing rage welling up inside me. They'd rather live in blissful ignorance, dismissing what was right in front of them. So I devised a plan. That night, as the moon hung overhead, a watchful eye, I set up candles in a makeshift circle, whispering the names of those who had vanished to the empty air, my breath mingling with the rising smoke. I pleaded for them to answer, for anyone to recognize the horror lurking beneath our feet. And just as I thought it was hopeless, the shadows coalesced into something sentient, tendrils of darkness reaching for me, caressing my skin with an understanding that terrified and exhilarated me. I saw faces emerge in the murky abyss, the lost children, their mouths moving in a silent scream. I had finally made contact, but it was too late. The door had swung wide open, revealing the boundless hunger behind it. Visions flooded my mind, horrors that should never be seen, families ripped apart, laughter turning into screams echoing into nothingness. I staggered back, the unholy knowledge weighing heavily on me, threatened to consume me. It was then I finally understood: the power was never meant to be mine, and the cost of silencing those wandering spirits was too great. In my desperate need for belief, I had awakened something monstrous. Just as I turned to run, I felt icy fingers clutch my wrist, dragging me back into the shadows. I screamed, an inhuman sound that echoed through empty streets, hoping someone would listen, hoping someone would pull me back from the brink. But the wind carried my cries away, drowned by the laughter of oblivion. Now, as I write this, trapped beyond the veil, I hope my voice can still reach you through this tale, pleading for you to heed the warnings etched in whispers. They never listen. They never believe. But if you hear my words, please, for the love of the lost, don't let the darkness in. It sits there, patient and waiting, and trust me, it needs no invitation.
I used to think adulthood would be a clear path away from childhood traumas, but I was wrong. Last week, in the corners of my mind, I brushed against memories I thought I'd buried forever. The night started as an innocent meet-up with old friends by the lake, our childhood hangout spot, but it turned into something far darker. I hadn't seen Thomas, Sarah, and Jenna in years. We laughed, reminisced about the wild days of running through the woods, building forts, and stealing sips of cheap beer. Everything felt perfect. Until it didn't. As the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness crept over the water, and a sudden chill set in. We decided to take a nighttime stroll along the shore, the moon casting eerie reflections on the rippling lake. That's when Sarah suggested we share ghost stories, the kind we used to tell that raised goosebumps on our skin as kids. Everyone was in, but the mood turned when Jenna spoke up. "There's the old Adams house," she said, her voice low and trembling with something else, fear. "You remember what happened there, right?" Suddenly, laughter faded, and memories retreated into the shadows. I could practically feel the air grow thicker as she recounted the legend of a boy named Alex. Years ago, he had gone missing in that house, supposedly wandering off in search of something in the dark. It was said that he still roamed the halls, waiting for someone to find him, and if he did, he'd only show himself to people with unfinished business. I scoffed at first, brushing it off as silly storytelling, but inside, a part of me shuddered. The unfinished business line stuck with me. I had left my childhood in shambles, departing before I could confront the things that haunted me, my family's issues, my mother's suffocating love that felt more like a noose, and my father's empty chair at dinner, a constant reminder of his absence. To distract myself from the creeping dread, I decided to take a walk away from the group, feeling the cool breeze on my skin. That's when I found myself standing in front of the Adams house, its decaying frame illuminated ominously by the moonlight. I don't know how I got there. Perhaps part of me was drawn by curiosity, or perhaps it was a desperate instinct to face the silence that had haunted me for so long. Against my better judgment, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. As if the house had been waiting for me, the musty air swallowed me whole. I could hear the floors creaking beneath my weight, a soft symphony of the past whispering secrets and sorrows. Memories flooded my mind, days spent battered by bullying, nights drenched in loneliness, and the distant echo of my parents' fights. The walls had seen it all, they almost seemed to breathe with the weight of their stories. I moved deeper into the house, compelled by a force I didn't understand. Climbing the staircase, I reached a room at the end of the hallway, a door slightly ajar. In that instant, I felt my heart race, as if my own childhood struggles were waiting there for me. I pushed the door open, and the room seemed to welcome me, coated in layers of dust and neglect. In one corner sat a child's rocking chair, its paint chipped, and on the wall hung an old photograph of a boy with bright eyes. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The boy looked eerily familiar. As I approached, memories hit me harder than before. The boy in the picture was Alex. Suddenly, I was pulled into a vivid memory from my childhood, one I had mercilessly tucked away. There was a hollow ache in my chest as I recalled a time when I had bullied Alex, a shy kid with a love for drawing. We had mocked him for his eccentricity, laughed at his art, and chased him away from the group. I remembered the day he stopped coming to school, the rumors, and the sense of guilt lounging in the back of my mind, unresolved, unknown. I hadn't known that something horrible had actually happened. It was like a cruel twist of fate that brought us both to this very house. The air thickened, the shadows twisting around me, and in that moment, I realized, Alex was not just the boy who had gone missing, he was also a part of me I'd buried under layers of denial. I was wrong, I whispered into the silence, releasing the words I had long held captive. I didn't understand. I'm sorry. At that instant, I felt a warmth envelop me, something I hadn't felt in years, a soft feather-like touch that washed over my skin like the gentlest of hugs. The room began to shimmer and glow, and I saw him standing in the corner, that same boy with bright eyes, watching me with a hopeful intensity. I forgive you, he said, his voice echoing softly around the room. Tears streamed down my cheeks as the weight of everything I had locked away began to unravel the tight grip I had on my heart. The shadows receded, and clarity found its way back into my soul. In the child's eyes, I saw both innocence and a depth of understanding that I never thought possible. Will you come back? He asked, his voice growing fainter. When you're ready, will you take what you've learned and share it with others? And with that, he began to fade. I didn't want him to leave. I will, I shouted, desperation clinging to my breath. I promise. And with that last echo, I jerked awake, finding myself lying on the floor of the abandoned room, the sun breaking through the window, washing everything in golden light. I stumbled outside, where my friends were waiting anxiously, worry etched across their faces. They asked where I had gone, and I shared the truth, the story of Alex, the haunting memories, and how in facing them, I found what I had long sought, healing. It wasn't just Alex's spirit that I had unburdened, it was my own. I took a deep breath of the fresh air, feeling lighter as the weight of childhood remorse began to slip away. That night, we gathered at the lakeside again, and as the stars twinkled above us, I shared my story, hoping that others could learn from it. I found a space to share my pain, to let go of the past, and to find redemption not only for Alex but for myself. When I faced my past, I didn't just find memories of shadows and sorrow, I discovered a path to healing, one that I would carry forward as a guiding light. Sometimes those invisible chains bind us tightly, but it takes a spark of courage to break free. Now, I'm on a journey to speak out about the experiences we bury, to honor those like Alex lost to our neglect and indifference. I found solace not just for myself but also the courage to face the past and gift others the chance to heal. All it took was one night, one forgotten house, and a long overdue apology to the boy who had been waiting all along. When I learned to trust my instincts, a life lesson. When I learned to trust my instincts, it wasn't in some quiet, introspective moment of clarity, it was during the most harrowing and surreal experience of my life, one that I still struggle to explain even now. It began on a Friday night when I decided to take the long way home from work. I don't know why I did it, maybe it was the weight of the week finally catching up to me or the gnawing feeling that I needed some kind of change, even a minor one. The usual route felt suffocating that evening, and the thought of mindlessly crawling through familiar intersections filled me with a strange unease I couldn't shake. So, I turned left instead of right and found myself driving down a stretch of road I hadn't taken in years. It was darker than I remembered, lined with tall trees that blocked out the moonlight and made the streetlights seem dim and ineffective. My headlights cut through the gloom, and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the pavement was oddly soothing at first. I rolled down the window, letting the crisp night air wash over me, and for a brief moment, I felt lighter, like I'd made the right choice. But then, about 10 minutes into my detour, I noticed something strange, a car behind me, keeping pace. It wasn't unusual to have someone driving in the same direction, but something about the way this car moved set my nerves on edge. It wasn't just following, it was mimicking. If I sped up, it sped up. If I slowed down, it did the same. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a coincidence, but the longer it went on, the harder it became to dismiss the sinking feeling in my gut. That's when the first real warning bell went off in my head, a voice, quiet but insistent, telling me to turn off the road, to see if the car would follow. I ignored it at first, rationalizing that I didn't want to overreact. But the voice grew louder, more urgent, until I finally gave in and took an abrupt right turn onto a side street. The car followed. My heart rate spiked, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But every instinct in my body was screaming at me now, telling me this wasn't normal. I drove for another block, my mind racing, and then made another sudden turn, this time onto a narrow residential street. The car stayed right behind me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of place where people locked their doors early and turned off their porch lights by 9. There was no one outside, no one to witness what was happening. I scanned the houses as I drove, searching for anything that might offer me some kind of refuge, a lit window, an open garage, anything. But it was as if the entire world had gone to sleep, leaving me alone with my rising panic. That's when I spotted the park. It was small and unassuming, just a patch of grass with a few benches and a playground, but it was well lit, and for some reason, it felt like a lifeline. I veered into the parking lot and pulled into a space, shutting off my engine and sitting there, heart pounding, as I watched the car glide to a stop at the lot's entrance. It didn't pull in. It just sat there, its headlights cutting through the dark, glaring at me like a predator sizing up its prey. Every fiber of my being was telling me to stay put, to not get out of the car, but then the voice in my head, the same one that had urged me to take the detour, to test if I was being followed, said something I didn't expect: run. It didn't make sense. I was safer in the car, wasn't I? But the voice didn't waver, and neither did the feeling in my gut. So, against all logic, I grabbed my phone and my keys and bolted from the car, sprinting across the park toward the far side where the houses were closer together. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs pumping harder than they had in years. When I reached the edge of the park, I ducked behind a row of bushes and crouched there, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel, slow and deliberate. Someone had gotten out of the car. My chest tightened, and I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle the sound of my breathing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just on the other side of the bushes. I could see the shadow of a figure, tall and imposing, illuminated by the park's lights. My heart felt like it was going to explode, but I stayed perfectly still, praying they wouldn't find me. And then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had appeared, they started to fade. I waited until I was sure they were gone, then crept out from my hiding spot and made a mad dash to the nearest house with a porch light on. I banged on the door, not caring how desperate I looked, and when an older woman finally answered, I practically collapsed into her entryway, trying to explain what had happened. She called the police, and when they arrived, the car was gone. The officers took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. They suggested I take a different route home next time and let me go with a warning to stay vigilant. I never found out who was in that car or what they wanted, but I'm certain that if I hadn't trusted my instincts that night, things could have ended very differently. That voice in my head, the one I'd ignored for so long, saved my life. And now, I listen to it, no matter how irrational or inconvenient it seems. Because sometimes, your gut knows things your mind can't explain, and ignoring it is a risk I'm no longer willing to take. Caught in a lie, my friend's betrayal unraveled. Caught in a lie, my friend's betrayal unraveled. I had always trusted Lena. She was more than my best friend, she was like a sister to me, someone who knew every embarrassing secret, every dream, every mistake. But looking back, I think that's what made her betrayal sting even more. It started small, almost trivial in retrospect. She began borrowing things and not returning them, books, clothes, even my headphones. She'd swear they were still at my place, or that she was just about to bring them over, but somehow, those things never made it back to me. Then came the weird excuses when I'd invite her out. She'd say she was busy with work, dealing with family issues, or, on one bizarre occasion, taking an online course in Icelandic, of all things. I brushed it off, figuring everyone gets caught up with their own life sometimes. But then one Friday night, while scrolling through my social media, I saw a photo of Lena out with a group of people I didn't know, including one person who looked disturbingly familiar, my ex, Matt. She'd been with him at the restaurant we'd planned to go to that night, and they were laughing together like they'd been close forever. It felt like someone had slapped me. Matt and I hadn't ended on bad terms, but seeing her with him, after claiming she was too busy to hang out, set off alarm bells. I tried to call her, hoping there was a logical explanation, but she didn't pick up. I sat there, stewing, replaying moments of our friendship in my head, trying to piece together clues I might have missed. The next morning, she called back with an excuse about her phone dying, sounding as cheerful and carefree as ever. I confronted her, asking her if she'd been out with Matt, and she laughed it off, saying, "Oh, that. It was just a coincidence. I ran into him randomly." But something about her tone made my skin crawl. It was too breezy, too dismissive. Over the next few weeks, I noticed even more strange behavior. She would avoid certain topics, especially when I mentioned Matt, and I started noticing changes in her social media. She had a habit of blocking me from seeing her stories whenever she went out, but mutual friends would send me screenshots of her with him, seemingly cozy and always at places I had introduced her to. I felt like I was going crazy, so I decided to dig deeper. One night, I reached out to a mutual friend who was at one of those gatherings and asked what was going on. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually admitted that Lena had been seeing Matt for a few months now. She told me that Lena had even gone so far as to make up lies about me to justify why she had reached out to him, painting me as some toxic ex-girlfriend who never treated him right. My stomach twisted as she recounted things Lena had supposedly said about me, lies so absurd yet so specific that they felt carefully crafted. Feeling both sickened and furious, I decided to confront her directly. I texted her, asking if we could meet up, and when she agreed, I knew it was finally time to hear her side. We met at a coffee shop, and I went in prepared for anything, but her reaction was worse than I could have imagined. She laughed at me, an eerie, dismissive chuckle, like this whole situation was some big joke. She tried to gaslight me, saying things like, "Oh, come on, you're being dramatic," and, "Matt came to me because he needed someone sane to talk to after dealing with you." Her words stung, twisting the knife deeper with every sentence, and for the first time, I realized that the friend I thought I knew had never truly existed. I left the coffee shop in a daze, feeling hollowed out, and blocked her number, vowing never to speak to her again. But things didn't end there. Weeks after cutting her off, I noticed strange messages from unknown accounts, vague threats and weird, unsettling comments about my personal life. I knew it was Lena trying to intimidate me, trying to make me feel as if I were the one in the wrong. Months later, I heard she and Matt had broken up, apparently in a messy split filled with the same lies and manipulations she had tried to use on me. Hearing this should have made me feel vindicated, but it only deepened my sadness for what had been lost. The person I had trusted most had turned out to be a stranger, someone willing to betray me without a second thought, and as much as I wished I could go back to those simpler days, I knew that some scars never fade. I've moved on, in some ways, building new friendships and focusing on my own life, but part of me will always be haunted by the betrayal, by the lies, by the friend I thought I knew but never truly did. I still remember the chill that crept down my spine that evening, even now, writing this almost a year later. I had just finished a long day at work and was trudging my way home, my mind clouded with thoughts of deadlines and bills. It was during this mundane walk, filled with the noise of passing cars and distant chatter, that I met the old man. He was sitting on a bench in the park, a worn-out newspaper resting on his lap, though I suspect he hadn't read it for quite some time. His gray beard was scraggly, his clothes tattered but clean. I didn't intend to talk to anyone, hell, I didn't even want to talk to myself. But there was something about the way he looked up at me, piercing green eyes filled with a blend of wisdom and sorrow, that pulled me in. As I walked past, he called out, "Hey, young one, can I share a secret with you?" Honestly, I almost kept walking, but something in the urgency of his tone stopped me. I hesitated, turned around, and sat down on the edge of the bench. "You won't regret it," he said, a faint smile creeping across his weathered face. His voice was raspy, like an old vinyl record, but oddly comforting. I was curious, I had no plans but to get home, and I wanted to hear what this stranger had to say. He began recounting a story that made my heart race. "You know," he said, "life isn't exactly as it appears. A curtain separates reality from illusion." At that moment, I thought he was simply delusional, an old man with wild notions. But the way he spoke, laced with emotion and nuance, felt like a challenge. I leaned in closer. He told me about a time in his life when he'd lost his wife, how he had fallen into a deep well of despair, and how he had begun to see shadows that whispered truths about his life. Within those shadows, he continued, reside the echoes of our choices, the forks in our journey. Intrigued, I asked him what he meant, and he leaned back, his eyes narrowing as if he were tapping into a reservoir of ancient wisdom. Every decision you make sends ripples through the fabric of your reality. You might think you are walking a straight path, but there are infinite branches along the way. It only takes one conversation to change everything. He pointed in the distance, where the last rays of sunset were fighting to hang onto the horizon. "That sun is just a reflection of what you can become," he said. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I could feel a kind of electric tension building up between us. "You ever met someone who changed your life?" he asked. I shrugged, considering. In truth, I had faced a series of monotonous relationships, friendships that faded just like my unmanicured nails grow dull over time. Hearing his question made me realize I hadn't really connected with anyone in quite some time. "In a way," I replied finally, "but nothing like this." And he smiled again, that knowing smile, one that suggested there was more to what I was saying than I realized. He looked at me intently. "Then let me open your eyes." And just like that, the mood shifted. It was as if the air itself had changed, heavy with the scent of potential unknowns. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "I'm not talking about a serendipitous encounter. I'm talking about a reckoning." It sounded dramatic, a phrase out of a film, but the way he said it sent shivers through me. The other night, I made a terrible choice. There was a man who asked for help, and I turned him away. That very night, he died. I didn't know him, yet I felt his spirit tugging at me. I had a choice, and I chose indifference. My breath caught. Since then, I've spent every evening here, the guilt gnawing at me like a rat in a pantry. Then he gripped my arm, so fiercely that I could feel his weathered fingers digging into my skin. "Young one, every moment wasted is a moment gone forever." One conversation could have changed his life. It could have saved mine. I sat in stunned silence. I could hardly grasp what he was saying, the gravity of his confession was almost too much to bear. The weight of his sorrow seemed to envelop me, a powerful force that hung in the air. I thought of my own life. The missed opportunities, the people I'd brushed aside. Would someone someday sit on a bench and wait for me to wish I had said something different? After a moment of contemplation, I asked him why he was telling me this. The old man's eyes glistened as he gazed at the sunset, now dipping beneath the horizon. "Because you're at a crossroads," he whispered, as if divulging a sacred secret. "You have the chance to choose differently." I glanced at my watch, realizing that I was running late, that I had to get home. Suddenly, the thought of returning to my mundane routine made me feel suffocated. What if I don't? I asked, half curious, half terrified. The man smiled knowingly. Then you'll continue down a path that leads to regret, just like I did. I didn't want to be like him. Suddenly, it felt overwhelmingly important to seize that night for what it was, a nudge toward awakening. For a brief moment, I had the urge to tell him that I would change, that I would reach out to those I had neglected. And it was an odd feeling, taking responsibility for my own choices. But as those thoughts churned, the old man stood up slowly, stretching his limbs as if breaking away from a spell. "Remember," he said, looking me dead in the eyes, "you have no idea how far-reaching one random conversation can be." And just like that, he wandered away, fading into the darkness, leaving me alone on that bench, the city buzzing with life around me. As I sat there, a knot twisted in my stomach, I felt as if I had been handed a brush to rewrite my own narrative. Days turned into weeks, and I reflected constantly on our conversation. I began reaching out to friends I hadn't talked to in years, reconnecting with family members. I volunteered at local charity events, even helping strangers on the streets. I felt alive for the first time in what seemed like forever. Yet, just when I thought everything was settling into a brighter day, a chilling memory surfaced like a phantom. One night, while enjoying a drink in a quiet bar, I overheard a conversation filled with laughter and camaraderie. Suddenly, the last two words stood out, "that man." I turned, and my heart dropped. They were talking about a tragedy that had occurred not far from the park. It was late when they output a last gasp of laughter and I heard one say, "What was his name?" "That old man who always talked about choices." The words hung in the air like a cloud of dread. A chill ran through my spine when I realized I could decipher who the man was, and that conversations I wished I had saved might have been the last opportunity to alter his fate. Days later, I returned to that empty park, feeling hollow. Though I changed my life dramatically, I often wondered if my transformations were hollow echoes past the limbs of time. As I stared at the empty bench, the weight of my choices pressed down on me. I realized now, I had to do more. Conversations are not just about life, they're about depth, connections that run far beyond surface interactions. I stood up, the air heavy with unresolved futures. And as the sun dipped once more beneath the horizon, I whispered a promise, not just to myself, but to those shadows of lost moments, I would not let my chance slip again. I'm telling you all this because life is fleeting, strange, and infinitely connected through conversations, whether with old men on park benches or with someone you think you know. You never know which chat or choice could tether you to a destiny you never imagined. So please, engage deeply with life. Cherish every word, every glance. Because once they slip away, you may not have the chance to whisper a change. And believe me, your own life may be depending on it. I can't believe I'm about to share this, but I feel like I need to tell my story, mostly because no one would believe it if I didn't. Every single word I'm about to write is true, and if you're reading this, you might want to just buckle up and get cozy. My partner, Alex, was struggling with something that none of my friends or family could truly understand. It started off small enough, with Alex seeming a little more withdrawn each day, but as time went on, there was a noticeable shift. I'd come home from work, and instead of the warm smile I was used to, there was just silence. It was like living in a house without echoes. I tried everything I could think of, cozy movie nights, elaborate dinners, and heartfelt conversations about feelings, but nothing seemed to break through the fog of despair that had enveloped them. I did some research, diving into articles about anxiety and depression, trying to arm myself with knowledge. But although I meant well, my attempts always fell flat. It was clear that something deeper and darker was lurking below the surface, something they didn't want to say out loud. Then it happened, one rainy Tuesday evening when all the world seemed dreary and gray. I was cooking dinner when I heard a soft sobbing coming from our bedroom. It was quiet, almost as if the tears were embarrassed to break the still air. I rushed in, and Alex was curled up under the covers, their shoulders shaking. I asked what was wrong, but they just told me to leave them alone. As hard as it was, I respected that, sitting silently on the edge of the bed as they cried. Minutes turned into hours, and finally, they managed to choke out a single sentence, "I can't do this anymore." My heart sank. That sentence felt like a death knell, echoing through my mind. I needed to do something to help them, but what? As I sat there, an idea began to form. What if I tried to bring a little light into the darkness? So the next day, I started a project. I wanted to create a little haven of positivity in our home. I dusted off our old craft supplies, stuff we'd rarely touched since moving in together. I started making a collage, a literal collage, of all the things I knew Alex loved, pictures of their family, memories from our vacations, illustrations of their favorite movies, songs written down that gave them comfort. I even added little quotes about hope and resilience that I hoped would resonate. I worked late into the night and even burned my fingers a little while hot gluing everything together, but every moment felt like it was worth it. When I finished, I felt like I had created something truly magical. I took it to their bedroom and gently placed it on the wall opposite the bed. "Alex, come look at this," I said, heart racing. At first, they only glanced at it, eyes still heavy with tears. But slowly, they started to take it in. I watched as their expression transformed from confusion to curiosity, then finally to a fragile smile. They approached the wall like it was a sacred display and traced the edges of the collage with shaking fingers. "Did you really do this for me?" they asked, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, fighting back my own tears. In that moment, something shifted in Alex's gaze, a flicker of hope ignited. From that point, they began to engage a little more, sharing their feelings, worries, and fears. One afternoon, in a particularly vulnerable moment, Alex opened up about their struggles with a past trauma that had haunted them. It was incredibly difficult for them to talk about, but they shared it anyway. I listened. I was a rock, steadfast and unwavering, and in time, I felt them starting to thaw out from the cold grip of despair. I organized small outings, a walk in the park, visits to our favorite ice cream shop, or even just watching the sunset on our balcony. Each little moment became a thread weaving us closer together. One Friday night, we set up our living room for a cozy movie marathon, complete with popcorn and fairy lights draped everywhere. It was fun and lighthearted, just two people enjoying each other's company. But midway through our favorite film, I noticed a change. Alex's eyes grew dark, and they suddenly looked distant. Panic gripped me. I reached over, placing a gentle hand on their arm, and asked them what was wrong. They jerked slightly, and I could see tears welling up again. I thought I had taken 10 steps backward. I didn't know what to do. But then they took a deep breath and opened up about how they sometimes felt guilty for dragging me into their struggles. "I want to be better for you, for us," they said, voice breaking. I didn't know how to respond, so I did the only thing I could. I pulled them into a hug, feeling all of their pain and fear seep into my skin. "You don't have to be better for me," I whispered. "You just have to be you." That night, we sat together, talking until the early hours. I listened, and they shared, and as the hours passed, the heaviness in the air felt a little lighter. It wasn't a cure, but it was progress. We moved slowly, some days were harder than others, but it felt like we were finally making our way through the fog, and I was grateful just to walk that path with them. Just when I thought we were on the right track, something unimaginable happened. A few weeks later, late one night, I heard a strange sound coming from the bathroom. It was a soft whimpering that seeped into my dreams like an unwanted fog. I leapt out of bed, heart racing, and rushed to see what was going on. When I burst through the door, I found Alex on the floor, seemingly in some sort of trance as they cradled something in their hands. As I got closer, my stomach sank. In their lap lay the remnants of the collage, the beautiful work I had put so much love into, torn apart and scattered. I felt as if the ground had shifted under my feet. "What happened?" I asked, voice shaking. Alex looked up at me, eyes wild and distraught. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. It was just too much, all the memories and pressure." They dropped the pieces, and I could see the regret flooding their features. "I can't do this. I can't handle being happy, it feels wrong. I'm so messed up." The chaos of it all sparked anger inside of me, anger I didn't know I had. But it was quickly subdued by the overwhelming sadness I felt for Alex. I rushed to gather the pieces, frantic, and as I did, an idea struck me, a dangerous one. "Okay," I said softly but firmly, "if it's too much, let's take it apart, piece by piece. We'll revisit those memories, and you can tell me why they're hard for you. It'll be our healing process." Their breath caught. I could see the hesitation in their eyes, but I pressed on. "Let's do it together, and we can build it again, this time, with everything you're feeling, and we'll make it stronger. I'll be here with you." For a long, tense moment, Alex searched my face as if looking for something, answers, hope, or maybe even permission. Then, slowly, they nodded. I dropped everything and sat beside them on the cold bathroom floor. One by one, we peeled back the layers of memories from the collage, each piece sparking a story. Some were poignant, some dark, but every one was woven with threads of truth. It was raw and painful, but it needed to happen. I stayed there, wrapped in the weight of their journey, listening intently as they shared memories they had buried deep, a lost pet, broken friendships, moments they felt unworthy of love. Hours flew by as we talked, barely taking pauses to breathe. I could see the tension slowly melting off Alex's shoulders as they shared, and the more pieces we uncovered, the more they looked like the person I had fallen in love with. Finally, as dawn began to break, we looked at everything we had pulled apart, and I sat back, wiping tears from my cheeks. Now, what's next? I asked softly, mentally exhausted but exhilarated. Alex stared at the piles of memories, and then they looked at me, a flicker of that old spark returning to their eyes. We put it back together, but this time we'll add a new piece, hope. They grabbed some blank papers, and together we began to fill them with colorful drawings, words of encouragement, and symbols of our journey. Soon, the collage transformed from a simple collection of memories into a vibrant testament to resilience. Each layer held stories of pain and healing woven into one. By sunup, we had rebuilt it, stronger than it was before, and Alex looked amazed at what we had created. In that moment, I knew we weren't free of the struggles that faced us, and the road to healing would be long. But as we sat there, exhausted yet more connected than ever, I realized something profound. I wasn't just helping my partner through a tough time, we were two souls navigating a storm together, learning to dance in the rain as we built our sanctuary from the chaos that life threw our way. And while I may have come up with that collage initially, it was Alex who was truly the artist, and together we were creating a masterpiece of our story. I always fancied myself a tough guy. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, you either learned to stand your ground or became a victim of someone else's. I took pride in my ability to shrug off pain, whether it was physical or emotional. I was indifferent, you see, a wall of cynicism built around my heart. I believed that vulnerability was for the weak. Life had taught me that everyone was out for themselves, and no amount of empathy could change that. But one chilly October evening, while walking home from my dead-end job at the corner store, an encounter turned my world upside down. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows grew long as I approached a familiar alleyway. I did the usual check for suspicious figures lurking in the darkness. That's when I heard it, a quiet sobbing, muffled but unmistakable. Curiosity got the better of me, leading me to the mouth of the alley. It was then I saw her, a teenage girl curled up against the brick wall, her knees pulled to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She was trembling, and I could feel an unwelcome twinge of unease crawling up my spine. Part of me wanted to turn away, chalk it up to some other kid's bad night, but instead, I found myself taking a tentative step closer. "Hey," I said awkwardly, immediately regretting the words. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide and glazed, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her. "No," she croaked, her voice cracking like fragile glass. My gut tightened at the rawness of her pain, but the words barely registered as I tried to process what was happening. "What happened?" I asked, and to my absolute surprise, she started to pour her heart out. Her story tumbled from her lips in an avalanche of broken dreams and despair. She had just lost her mother to cancer and was forced to live with an abusive uncle who took every opportunity to reinforce how worthless she was. I stood there, feeling like a statue, my tough guy facade crumbling. It was hard to understand the pain she described. I had never been thrust into such darkness. While the stories I'd heard from friends about their families seemed trite compared to what this girl was enduring, something in me broke open. As she spoke, my mind whirled with fragmented memories of insults I had hurled to toughen people up, taunts I had ridiculed those vulnerable to fit in. My heart raced, and for the first time, I felt that crushing weight of empathy, the understanding of someone else's suffering resonating painfully in my own chest. I squatted down, trying to meet her gaze. "You're not worthless," I murmured, the words soft and awkward. "You're not alone, either." I expected her to scoff or roll her eyes, but instead, her tears flowed again, making her face glisten in the dim light. Something inside me shifted. I was no longer just an observer in her pain. I was a participant. We talked for what seemed like hours while the autumn air bit at our exposed skin. We shared stories, bonded over the cruel nature of the world, and by the time I left the alley, I felt a sense of weightlessness, the heaviness of my cynicism replaced by some small ember of understanding. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of that girl. I started to hesitate when ready to dismiss others' pain, considering instead how someone else might perceive their struggles. My coworkers noticed the slight change in me when I handed them the book I bought for a struggling friend. I started inviting friends out that I typically wouldn't have bothered. I wanted to do something meaningful for others, carrying the same compassion I found for that young girl into my everyday life. I often returned to that alley. I hoped to see her again. It didn't take long before I did. A week later, I found her sitting in the same spot. This time, she lit up at the sight of me. "You came back." Her face split into a smile, and I realized then how rare that was, considering the depths of her despair. I sat down next to her, and we picked up our conversations where we left off. I learned she loved drawing, an escape from her reality, yet her uncle had ripped that away by tossing her sketchbook in the trash. So, I bought her a new one. The next week, I brought her some colored pencils. She giggled through tears, and that sound was like music. Each time I returned, the laughter grew louder, the heaviness of her life felt lighter. She confided in me about her dreams, and I opened up about mine, a lifetime spent shielding myself from heartache and hiding my own fears beneath bravado. It was during that third visit that the shadows stretched long, and as we shared yet another deep laugh, I saw a figure at the alley mouth. The menacing build of her uncle loomed in the faint glow of the streetlight. My stomach dropped as I realized he was searching for her. My instinct kicked in. I grabbed her hand before she could speak. "Come with me," I whispered urgently, and we dashed deeper into the shadows, away from the growing threat. My heart raced, fear coursing through my veins. We zigzagged through alleyways until I led her to my tiny apartment in the next neighborhood over. She was terrified, yet trusting, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of her trust resting squarely upon my shoulders. For the next few days, she stayed with me as anxiety morphed into a new routine. I found myself protecting her more than I knew how, knowing by then the battles she faced. But all my efforts lay bare in stark contrast to the horrors waiting beyond my door. One cold evening, as we watched old cartoons and shared laughs, I heard an insistent banging. My heart sank. I looked at her, her eyes wide with terror. "It's him," she whispered. I rushed to the door, but the pounding continued, relentless. I told her to hide. She ducked into the bathroom, fear plastered across her face. I knew if he got in, he'd hurt both of us. I faced what courage I could muster, opened the door, and was met by her uncle's furious and bloated visage. "Where is she?" He spat, his eyes wild with rage. I stood my ground, but something in me felt small against the fury radiating from him. He shoved past me, and I instinctively lunged forward, desperate to protect her. The adrenaline surged through me, and a primal need to defend arose. I took a wild swing, hitting him squarely in the nose. He staggered back, momentarily disoriented, but it wasn't enough. He lunged at me, fists moving like a whirlwind. The next moments turned into a blur of chaos. We grappled, the dull ache of pain seeping into my muscles as I slammed against the wall, trying to keep him from reaching her. Each punch exchanged felt like snapping twigs in a silence shattered by muffled fear. It was a primal dance of brutality and instinct, and as he swung again, the sickening crunch of his hand against my ribs shattered my focus. Every blow that landed resonated with guilt, the thought of her seeing me become what I despised held me captive. But then I remembered her laughter, her dreams, her vulnerability intertwined with my newfound empathy. It fueled my resolve, surging through the pain. I drove myself forward, pushing him back, surprise etching across his face as I landed another hit. And finally, he stumbled back, gasping in a mix of shock and fury. "You think you can keep her?" he screamed, before taking off into the night. Breathing heavily, I turned to the bathroom. "It's okay. It's over." But when I opened the door, she wasn't there. Panic cascaded over me, a wave of despair flooding my heart. I searched frantically, calling her name, only to hear nothing but echoing silence. My worst fears spun out of control as the minutes felt like hours. I stumbled back into the living room, heart racing, when the door creaked back. I whipped my head up to find her standing there, trembling yet determined, clutching a small backpack filled with her drawings. "I'm leaving," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. My heart shattered. No, you don't have to. I pleaded, the empathy I had found burning hotter than ever. Stay. We can fight this together. But she shook her head, the weight of her fears anchoring her spirit. You've been so kind, but I can't let him find me. You deserve better, you can't fight this battle for me. She turned to leave, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. And in that moment, I learned the hardest lesson of all, the depths of sacrifice, how empathy can compel someone to let go, to let a small flame flicker out for the greater good. I stood paralyzed with grief as she vanished, the intimacy we had built now a haunting memory. Days passed, then weeks. Life resumed its predictable course, but I carried her memories with me, each encounter echoing faintly in my heart. I still walked those alleyways, haunted by her absence, the harsh reality of her struggles serving as a constant reminder of my failure to protect someone so deserving. But through that pain, I learned something ineffably valuable, that no act of empathy is ever wasted. As I forged deeper connections with those around me, I began to understand humanity on a level I had never reached before, using that experience to reach others suffering in silence. I became their strength, their voice. Empathy had etched itself into my soul, a guiding light against the encroaching darkness. It taught me that our struggles are never in vain, that each connection, painful or beautiful, is a step toward healing. And as I closed my eyes each night, I hoped that wherever she was finding a sense of hope that I could one day share with others. The importance of empathy hadn't just changed me, it had saved me, marking the beginning of my journey toward not just understanding pain, but conquering it together.
The wedding was supposed to be a joyous occasion, an evening filled with laughter, love, and a hint of magic, but all of that changed the moment I stepped inside the dimly lit reception hall, dressed in a striking teal gown that, under a black light, transformed into something straight out of a horror flick, a glowing white apparition that sent shivers down my spine and stirred a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I'd chosen the dress for its elegance and whimsy, completely oblivious to how the venue's unique lighting could morph it into an unwelcome sight. The startled gasps that rippled through the crowd as I walked in hit me like a slap to the face, and I should have turned around right then, fled the scene of my accidental monstrosity, but something primal held me back, an eerie compulsion to stand my ground despite the way the bride's face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and rage, and her bridesmaid shot me furious glances that felt like daggers. As I stood there, rooted to the spot, I could hear whispers cutting through the room like a knife. How could I be so selfish, wearing something that would upstage the bride on her special day? Didn't I know better than to wear anything that might distract from the beauty of her white gown, an accusation that pricked at my skin like the harsh chill of the autumn air? I felt the stares converge on me like the gathering storm clouds outside, each look was laden with judgment, as though I was a ghost haunting their celebration, and I wanted to explain, to plead my case that I hadn't intended to offend, to steal the spotlight. How could I? I was just a guest, a longtime friend of the couple, trying to celebrate their love with my own style that had turned into a curse. The bride's father stormed up to me, his voice booming over the music, demanding to know why I was still there, pointing out that I was ruining the entire night and that I needed to leave immediately. His spat of anger felt like a physical blow, and for a moment, my head spun with the vertigo of shame and confusion, but I stood firm, insisting I wouldn't leave, that this was my dress, my choice, and it wasn't my fault something as innocuous as a black light had turned me into a pariah. It was at that moment a strange pulse reverberated through the room, vibrating with a palpable energy that wrapped around me, whispering that there was something darker beneath this absurdity, something that reached beyond mere social etiquette into the heart of something I couldn't yet understand. As the arguments erupted around me, friends rallied to my side while others sided with the bride. Glaring accusations turned ugly as tears swelled in the bride's eyes, alternating between sadness and fury that twisted my gut, a chaotic scene unfolding like a poorly scripted horror film, and deep down, my mind raced to piece together why the atmosphere felt so charged, teetering on the brink of surreal as if something otherworldly was toiling in our midst. Through the cacophony, I caught fleeting glimpses of shadows dancing in the corners of the room that shouldn't have been there. An odd flicker at the edge of my vision made my heart race, and I was suddenly aware of the moon's pale light streaming through the windows, casting long shadows that stretched eerily across the floor, morphing into shapes that looked almost human, like figures lurking just at the periphery of the gathering, their mouths moving silently as if they were warning me from some great distance. That strange pulse grew stronger, feeding off the tension brewing in the air, a storm ready to explode into chaos, and before I knew it, I couldn't tell if it was my imagination spiraling deeper into madness or something real, something that belonged to this night of wreckage where I stood, refusing to budge while the weight of unseen eyes fixed upon me. The bride's anger reached a boiling point, her voice pitched sharp as she accused me of seeking attention, as if I had orchestrated this entire scene to showcase an outfit that had spectacularly backfired. I felt the sting of betrayal from my friends who had momentarily turned against me, their expressions twisted between sympathy and shame, and in the midst of it all, I could feel my resolve beginning to crumble. But the shadows roused something primal within me, a ghostly chorus of voices echoing warnings, urging me to stay put, to confront whatever dark forces were converging in this haunted atmosphere, for I was not just an unwilling participant in a wedding gone wrong but perhaps something far more significant in a narrative woven into the very fabric of this night. The air became thick with hostility, and suddenly, with a deafening crack like thunder, the light bulbs began to flicker, and a powerful tremor rattled the room, sending chandeliers swaying, casting erratic flashes of light that shadowed everyone's face in a grotesque mix of fear and confusion, and as I stood defiantly, I sensed a figure materialize from the shadows, gliding through the crowd, their presence chilling the atmosphere as the evident anguish enveloped me. It was the ghost of something lost, perhaps a love unfulfilled within the echoes of this very hall, speaking now in a language I could feel but not understand, and I stood in bewilderment as the thing, whatever it was, locked eyes with me, its gaze crawling over my flesh like a million icy fingers, merging the chaos of the wedding into a surreal frenzy that spiraled beyond the ruins of social decorum. With the wedding party erupting into panic, as if the very fabric of reality was fraying, cool air slithered down my spine, and from somewhere deep within, a flicker of insight sparked. It was as if by refusing to leave, I had unwittingly invoked something ancient, awakening it from slumber, and as a blinding light burst forth from the ceiling, engulfing the entire space, I could feel the chains of time break as past and present collided, ominous specters swirling in a dance of rage and betrayal, exposed to a collective memory that slipped through my fingers, and that's when I realized it wasn't about the dress at all. What I had thought was a silly wedding mishap had connected me to something far darker, awakening spirits that demanded resolution, who hungered for a tale long overlooked, and as the tempest of color and sound imploded around me, I stood there, resolute and transfixed, as if I alone could confront this newfound reality, caught in a spectral clash of love and vengeance that whispered that I belonged within this spellbinding disaster, where perhaps my refusal to leave held the key to unveiling the shadows of the past that hungered to be acknowledged, and I dared to ask, was I really the villain, or merely a vessel for something that needed to be freed?